benefited by supplying illegal alcohol to willing urban customers. But I think it's incorrect to say that prohibition increased the power or the income of organized crime. But by 1928, there was a shift in public attitude about prohibition. Many people who had supported it had come to favor its repeal, partly because it stimulated illegal activity, but also because there was growing sentiment against government interfering with purely personal choices. With prohibition, enthusiasm for progressive moral reform movements faded, and more Americans wanted to reclaim their autonomy from majority will instead of allowing themselves to become pieces of clay to be modeled into good examples of good wholesome Christian American life. There was also a problem for conservatives. If you remember Herbert Hoover, in his way he approached the Mississippi Valley flooding in 1929, he said, "I didn't have to call in the army, I called in Main Street." But what happens if Main Street is not helping you enforce prohibition? What if the law is not self-enforcing? The whole part of the idea of prohibition is that the United Americans, the citizens of the United States, wanted to be moral people. They wanted to be purified. So you shouldn't have to police it. For conservatives, it became clear by 1929 that if you were going to maintain prohibition, you were going to have to create a large bureaucracy and a large national police force. And this seemed to contradict the whole purpose of prohibition, which was not to oppress the American people, but to remove an oppressor and allow them to to take charge of their lives. And the idea of voting money to increase the enforcement operations increasingly became more and more difficult for not just economic conservatives, but for moral conservatives as well. It seemed to be a conflict. If people were, in fact, inherently sinful, then it wasn't the government's job to stop them from being sinful. The government's job was to stop the corruptors, to stop the corruptors from giving a bad influence on people who were weak but inherently reformable and purifiable. By the beginning of the 1930s, the Democratic Party had come to call for the repeal of prohibition, primarily on a libertarian basis, but also that enforcement was a poor investment of government resources during the Depression. Herbert Hoover stood for the maintenance of prohibition, but without any increase in the enforcement mechanism. Since Roosevelt won the election and the Democrats took over Congress, they acted in 1933 to legalize beer and wine, and then sent to the states the 21st Amendment, which repealed prohibition, which was ratified within 6 months. Over the opposition of Protestant religious groups. The 21st Amendment allowed local options so states and counties could remain dry if they wanted to. Part of the repeal of prohibition was also due to important political shifts that were based in demographics. The children of immigrants increasingly mobilized to vote, starting in 1928. And across the country, newer Americans became a force to be reckoned with. And part of what they wanted to do was to defend the legitimacy of their cultural heritages and to oppose what they called narrow Puritanism. So in voting against prohibition, they were asserting a broadened view of who was an American. And defense of an exclusive understanding of the American nation was no longer good politics in many states. This is going to be, we'll get into this with the New Deal, this is a major theme in the New Deal, is the opening up of American life to groups that had been in a subordinated and often discriminated position. So, the 1920s is also a period in which religious groups in the United States, having come to feel that Prohibition was their greatest success in directing a sinful people towards a better path, fractured. Ironically, this has to do with the formation of the fundamentalist movement in the United States. Fundamentalism, as a religious idea, originated in the Presbyterian Church as a critique of the importation of modernist scientific criticism into religion, and a defense of biblical, conservative biblical interpretation, traditions of biblical interpretation. As part of this defense, the Presbyterians proposed to a wide group of other Protestant churches that they discuss what they held in common, so that they could better collectively defend Protestant Christianity from secularism on the one hand and atheism as well. And there were a series of conferences and a series of publications which were called the Fundamentals of Christian. The conference was the General Conference on Christian Fundamentals, and then there was a series of publications looking at the fundamentals of Christian faith. Because this was an interdenominational group, the first fundamentalists disagreed about most important theological issues. And so they agreed on 5 points and 5 points only. The first was the inerrancy of the Scripture, that nothing in the Bible was irrelevant for modern men and women or needed to be interpreted away. The second was the virgin birth of Christ. The third was the authenticity of the miracles described in the Bible. The fourth was Christ's bodily resurrection was a promise for the future kingdom in which all believers, living and dead, would be united eternally. And the last was Christ's death was God's free sacrifice to redeem humanity from original sin. There were many, many points, particularly in the interpretation of these 5 points, in which there were basic disagreements, but they could agree that they all agreed on these 5 points. As fundamentalism emerged, it was articulating many values that were characteristic of 19th century Protestant evangelical revivalism, but in an effort to keep them relevant for modern life. Fundamentalists were not particularly anti-modern, anti-corporate, anti-scientific. They did not oppose technology, the market, or the corporation. They did not necessarily oppose Darwin. They did believe that human pride inevitably led people to turn away from God, and at that point, men and women could only become monsters, dedicated to destroying each other, so that an American society that was divorced from religious values would have to be a travesty, would have to be a nightmare place. They believed, and this is part of the jingoistic nationalism of the time. excuse me, jingoistic nationalism of the time, that Germany had become the model of what happens to a society when it turns away from God. So the murder of innocent people, the going down the path to war, and thus Christians had to become more aggressive to prevent the United States from becoming a society like Germany. Now, it's a caricature of what Germany actually was, but this is how they talked. And thus Christians had to, without wanting to take over the government or subvert democracy, affirm a more important role for Christian values in public life. And you had to do so aggressively, because the power of godlessness was growing in the United States from their perspective. You had to adopt a position of uncompromising opposition. Prohibition for the fundamentalists, which at this time is basically the mainstream Protestant denominations. The Presbyterians, the Lutherans, the Baptists, the Methodists, the Congregationalists, was necessary in order to reestablish America's submission to divine rule. But then it went a little bit further. And it was, in fact, actually the anti-Darwin crusades that split fundamentalism. One of the marked developments of the 1920s was the emergence of a new movement of conservative Protestants denouncing Darwinian evolutionary theory and engaging in political action to ban the teaching of evolution from public schools. The first law of this kind was passed in Tennessee in 1925, and it set the stage for the Scopes trial in Dayton, Tennessee, a small town in the eastern part of the state. Probably you've all heard of the Scopes monkey trial. The trial became a symbol of a supposed war between secularists in American society and backward religious fanatics. And the term fundamentalist left religious circles and entered the mass media during the Scopes trial, largely thanks to one journalist, the Baltimore gadfly, H.L. Mencken, M-E-N-C-K-E-N. He stressed for his readers around the country the dangers of this anti-evolutionary thinking, and he particularly focused on the figure of William Jennings Bryan, who had been 3 times the presidential nominee of the Democratic Party. He was President Wilson's first Secretary of State. He had resigned when he became convinced that Wilson was determined to go to war, enter the war. He had been a farm populist from Nebraska, and he became